main title is It's a History of Political Rhetoric, and I'm going to talk about origins, possibilities, and challenges. So some of it will be on the history of rhetoric. Possibilities is going to get at how people have thought rhetoric works. And the challenges is really going to focus on the current moment, because I understand this is part of a broader suite of programming. The organization is just as follows. I'm going to start out talking about what is rhetoric, and at the beginning I'll talk mostly about the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle and a little bit about the Roman philosopher, orator, statesman Cicero. So what is rhetoric? What are the elements of rhetoric? And what makes persuasion, which is what rhetoric does, possible? Okay? And then we're going to talk about the case against rhetoric, and there I've selected two writers, one ancient, so the Greek philosopher Plato, one modern 17th century English, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and that's really leading us into the 18th century, where we're going to encounter the American founding period. I'll talk about James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, both highly influential members of that first generation of Americans. And then I'll also talk a little bit about Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher who influenced both of them deeply. And then I'm going to turn to what's going on today, talking about first polarization, second partisanship or partisan identities, third social media, and this will be talking much more about contemporary social science, not the history of rhetoric, but I'm going to try and connect this all. And then at the end I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges and how we might think about meeting them, especially at the citizen level, at the level of the ordinary American, and what we can actually do. So I'll start. So politicians talk, right? Human beings talk, but politicians talk. And this is especially true of politicians in democratic societies. This seems to have been true for as far back as we have written records, in fact. And it's especially the case in what is one of the first democratic societies in the Western world, which is classical Athens, which is where we're starting with Aristotle. Now, one thing that's clear about classical Athens is that power was exercised there through and also mediated by speech, meaning the Athenian government exercised its power. It reached decisions, it implemented decisions through language, through speech. And if we ask why is this the case, it really goes to the nature of a democratic regime. Democracy, the Greek word, comes from two Greek terms, demos, which means people, so think of our terms demography, the study of people, or the study of peoples, and then kratia, right, or kratos, which means power. So democracy literally means something like power of the people, or really rule of the people. So if we think back on classical Athens, the Athens of Socrates, the Athens of Plato, you were, if you were a member of the people, a ruler of a sort. And if you were an Athenian citizen in both theory and practice, you could shape the exercise of power, okay? Whether in the assemblies, right, where all the citizens would come and talk and vote, or in the courts. Now, why then begin in Athens if we're going to start talking about rhetoric and politics today? Well, my contention is going to be that if we want to think about rhetoric, we're well suited to start in classical Athens, because it's in classical Athens that people really start to first think systematically about rhetoric. And that's why I'm going to in particular start here with Aristotle. Now, Aristotle wasn't actually from Athens, and when he's writing, this is after the heyday of classical Athens, but he is reflecting on the actual practice of persuasive speech in Athens. And if you ask the question, what is rhetoric, to Aristotle, that is his answer, right? This is from his book, The Rhetoric, Book 1, Chapter 2. Rhetoric may be defined as the faculty of observing in any given case, any given situation, the available means of persuasion. Rhetoric we look upon as the power of observing the means of persuasion on almost every subject presented to us. So what he's getting at is this: if you study rhetoric, you're studying how to be persuasive. You're studying how to persuade and what you in any particular moment can use to persuade. So I think that's a pretty intuitive definition, and that's part of the reason I start with Aristotle. But then if we ask the question, how did he actually think it worked? It works by what he calls proofs, or what I'm just putting there instead as means of persuasion. And you'll probably be familiar with this. If you've taken a course on composition or rhetoric, you know the terms: ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos refers to the character of the speaker. So Aristotle thought there's something about the way you project your character as a speaker that makes you trustworthy and makes you persuasive. There's pathos. That's the emotional state of the audience. And then there's logos, or logos. That's the actual formal argument, the evidence you might bring in, and so forth. Now, Aristotle thinks that it's a combination of these three things, these three means, that help you speak persuasively. And these are the things you're observing, in a sense, when you do speak persuasively. So again, he thought it's imperative that you as an orator display trustworthiness, that people believe you. You have to understand how to either produce certain emotions in your audience or get certain emotions to die down. If they're angry and you don't want them angry, you've got to soothe them, for example. And then there is the actual argument, or as he puts it, the words of the speech itself. But that's not all we can say about rhetoric. And here I want to turn to Cicero. He's writing roughly, about 250 years or so after Aristotle. He's Roman. He knows Aristotle very well. He knows Plato as well too. But his innovation is to think about style, right? And what he thinks is the case is this: when you speak, not only do you have to think about your character, the audience's emotions, the argument you might use, you also have to think about how you speak, about the style of your speech. So he says there's really three kinds of style. There's the grand. This is powerful oratory, lots of figures of speech, lots of emotional engagement. There's the plain. The plain is analogous to really what I'm doing. It's more person to person, not high-powered oratory, fairly simple speech. And then there's the middle, which is, what you think it is. It's somewhere between the two. Now, each of these styles, he thinks, is useful to certain occasions or to certain tasks. And sometimes in a particular speech, you might mix all three. But what we're seeing then with Cicero is he's really thinking about the sort of presentation, the delivery of the orator in a way that Aristotle's not as attuned to, quite arguably. Now, so far, I have taken you through 400 years of Greco-Roman rhetoric, mostly in theory, not practice so much, in a talk that's leading to our political moment. Now the question is, why have I done this? And I will just note for fun, what I've just done is a rhetorical question, right? And you know it's a rhetorical question because I don't actually want you to answer it, and I'm going to give you the answer, right? That is actually a Ciceronian type of device that I've just deployed. But the answer to this question is that in classical rhetoric, we see a certain set of assumptions about what makes possible persuasion, right? I, the speaker, speaking to an audience, can persuade them because, and I'll talk about these, number one, Aristotle thinks that really everybody gets rhetoric in a way. That's why I have this New Yorker cartoon. I apologize, the font's very small, but here we have some cavemen sitting around a fire, and the caption is, we'll start out by speaking in simple declarative sentences, right? So language, the activity of speaking, is intimately involved in rhetoric. And Aristotle thinks that. But he also thinks, and I'll talk a bit about each of these, that part of the reason why we can speak persuasively is because we can understand our audiences, and we can understand them pretty well. Now, on this first point, Aristotle thinks that speaking is part of human nature. He says this all over his writings. It is widespread, and to the extent that human beings use language, and we do, we all, in a way, use rhetoric. It's common sense. And if common sense is a common feature of human beings, it follows that they can judge what I'm saying, right? You can judge pretty effectively what someone says just by virtue of living in the world with them, by virtue of sharing a language with them. So that is the first point. Now the second point is this. Aristotle thinks that we can speak persuasively and we can persuade an audience because audiences are predictable in certain ways. And so I've given one example. This is Aristotle's Rhetoric, and he basically says that different ages of people have different kinds of characters. So here he's talking about young men, and it's classical Athens. This will be an audience primarily or exclusively of men. But he says they've got strong passions, they gratify them indiscriminately, they're changeable and fickle, their desires are violent while they last, but they're quickly over, they're hot-tempered and quick-tempered, they love honor, they love victory even more, they look at the good side rather than the bad, so they're optimistic, he says, because they have not yet witnessed many instances of wickedness. So his idea is this: if you can sort of look out at your audience and see them, you can figure out, okay, this is how I should speak to them. You can form a pretty quick snapshot or mental image and adjust your speech accordingly. Now, we've got proofs, we have style, we have an audience that is probably fairly predictable, and we've got common ground as a result. Your audience can be assumed to share certain things. If they don't, how can you persuade them? Now, the next point. Even though classical rhetoric is born in Athens, refined in Rome, not all ancient thinkers liked rhetoric all that much. And I've selected Plato as an example of this, right? Plato, greatest of the Greek philosophers, the first, as far as we know, to think systematically about rhetoric, doesn't seem to like it all that much. And this is because he thinks something like this: if I can speak persuasively to you about something, it's either because I have knowledge, right? Think of your physician. You go see the doctor, he or she speaks to you persuasively. It's because they're physicians. They have actual knowledge of medicine. Or, if it's not that, says Plato, it's something separate from the specific knowledge. And if it's that, if you can be persuasive without knowing what you're talking about, you persuade people by a kind of trick. You hoodwink them. Right? It's all just rhetoric, the kind of terms you'll actually hear. That's what he's getting at. So Plato says something like this: it persuades by a trick, not by means of knowledge. And he says this holds of the relation of rhetoric to all the other arts. The rhetorician need not know the truth about things. He only has to discover some way of persuading the ignorant that he has more knowledge than those who know. Okay? So that's the Platonic objection to rhetoric. It's the blind leading the blind, and the way the rhetorician or the orator persuades people is by pandering, by flattery, by emotional appeals. Jump forward now to the 17th century. We're coming close to where we are, and here we have the glowering visage of Thomas Hobbes, the great and greatest English philosopher. Thomas Hobbes was not a very big fan of rhetoric either, but whereas Plato's really worried about rhetoric because he thinks it's irrational in some way, it moves by emotions, we manipulate people, Hobbes is very different, right? Hobbes, first of all, knows Latin and Greek exceptionally well. He even did a sort of translation of Aristotle's Rhetoric. But why Hobbes in particular, besides his knowledge of the classics? Well, he thinks that it is destabilizing. It is built upon disagreement, and it gives rise to disagreement. Think about it this way. If I am arguing one side of a judicial case and you're arguing the other, I'm probably going to take the same phenomenon you're describing it and describe it in opposite terms. So I'm not disputing the facts of the case, but I'm giving them this description and you give them that one. Now that can give you pause. This is part of the reason why some people think lawyers are dishonest, for example. But it's not only that we do this when we're arguing for Hobbes. He thinks we do this whenever we use moral language, at least normally speaking. I can describe something as courageous, right? And you could describe the same thing as cowardly. And we're not disagreeing about the phenomenon that happened. We're just describing it differently. Why? Because when I describe something, I am describing it. My interests, my desires, my backgrounds, and the same for you. I may be honest, or I may not be honest, by the way, when I say things. I may not even know them myself, or these facts about myself. So Cicero or Aristotle saw rhetoric as a means of producing agreement. Hobbes is profoundly skeptical. This is why he says, right, especially this is the case, he says, when we're talking about virtues or vices, so 17th century spelling, that's why it looks a little funny. One man calleth wisdom what another calleth fear. Therefore such names can never be true grounds of any ratiocination, meaning rational thought process. You can't reason based on these. No more can metaphors and tropes of speech, right? The flowers of language that you hear when you hear grand oratory. These are less dangerous because, he says, they profess their inconstancy. He thinks basically when you hear someone engage in highfalutin rhetoric, you know they're up to something. But when I tell you that someone's just done something cowardly, I'm not showing what I'm doing. And that, he thinks, is especially dangerous. Right? Now, what he's doing is basically saying there is no common ground, at least normally. It's not the way language works. Now, we're going to step forward again. We're in the 18th century. This is the century in which the United States comes into being. How do thinkers in the 18th century tend to view rhetoric? Now, plenty of people dislike it, and they dislike it for reasons very similar to Plato and very similar to Thomas Hobbes, but not everybody does. The person whose image is there on the screen is Adam Smith, the great Scottish philosopher, probably the greatest Scottish philosopher, 1723 to 1790, well known for his work, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. He's somebody who is deeply influential on our side of the pond. People are reading him in America, in the colonies, and then the New Republic. And Smith actually likes rhetoric. He likes it quite a lot, right? This passage is taken from a work of his called the Lectures on Jurisprudence. And what he's talking about here is the division of labor, right? But he's trying to get at something beyond the division of labor and specialization. Why is it that human beings engage in exchange? That's what he's asking. The reason, he says, is this. The principle to persuade, which so much prevails in human nature, that's why people will exchange one thing for another, which as an economist is his fundamental concern. When any arguments are offered to persuade, it's expected they should have their proper effect. If a person asserts anything about the moon, though it should not be true, he will feel a kind of uneasiness in being contradicted. We want people to believe us. We feel uneasy when we don't have that connection, that sharing of sentiments. We would be very glad that the person he's endeavoring to persuade should be the same way of thinking with himself. We ought then, he says, mainly to cultivate the power of persuasion, and indeed we do so without intending it. So you can hear shades of Aristotle. Persuasion is just what we do. It's necessary. It's a good thing. This is what allows for commerce, says Adam Smith, the great theorist of commerce in the 18th century. Now, why did I pick Smith? Because Smith and the other writers of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment, they were very influential in the States, or what would become the States, I should say. Indeed, some of the rebellious British subjects who went on to write the Constitution were in correspondence with some of the very people who were over in Scotland thinking about these issues. Benjamin Franklin, for example, corresponds with David Hume, a close friend of Adam Smith. Now, what did people in America in the late 18th century who framed our system of government, what did they think about rhetoric? We're going to turn first to James Madison. Okay? Now, Madison did say famously or infamously in Federalist 55, the Federalist Papers were a series of pamphlets written by supporters of the federal Constitution to try and get people in the states to adopt them. He did say in Federalist number 55 this: even if, he says, in essence, every Athenian had been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would be a mob. So it doesn't sound like he's got a lot of faith in democracy and collective self-rule and, by extension, rhetoric. But it doesn't really show that he wanted to get rid of disagreement either. He thinks disagreement is important. Disagreement, as you see here, is a function of liberty, right? So here what he's talking about is factions, and what he means by factions are small groups and sometimes large groups of people with interests opposed to those of other people, okay? And it's a danger. He thinks this is a problem in free societies, in republican governments. But he says there's two ways to get rid of faction. One is destroying the liberty essential to its existence. The other, by giving every citizen the same opinions, passions, and interests, right? That, by the way, is Hobbes' solution to the problem of disagreement. It's what he wants to do. Madison said, the first remedy is worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire. An aliment without which, or an aliment, I should say, without which it instantly expires, right? And if you have a free society, you cannot give everybody the same opinions and passions. So what Madison sees is so long as we in America have political liberty, we will have disagreement, and it's okay. The key for him is to put in place institutions to deal with it. And you know the institutions, right? Congress, right? The House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, the Bill of Rights, all of these kinds of things. So that's Madison. What about Alexander Hamilton, who's been making something of a comeback lately, as we know, right? Hamilton is worried about rhetoric. He sees the dangers, right? And part of what you're seeing in this quote, right, is that Hamilton is really worrying about the turmoil that's accompanying the creation of the Constitution. And he's really here talking about people who, in his view, are worried about the federal Constitution, the so-called anti-federalists. History says, will teach us that the former, right, the dangerous ambition he's talking about, the former has been found a much more certain road to the introduction of despotism than the latter. Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court. So flattering the people, that's what he's talking about. Commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. So he's worried about rhetoric, but even Hamilton does not think we can simply get rid of it. Again, we use institutions. That's the way we solve the problem. We have participation, we have government by speech and not force, and we can help deal with the worries of Plato and Aristotle. So now we have the ancient account of rhetoric, how it works, the ancient account and the modern account against rhetoric, and how some 18th century thinkers thought about rhetoric. Where does that leave us in understanding the challenges of the moment? And here I'm going to talk much more about social science, okay? Now, this first slide gets at what's called polarization. I'm sure this is a term you've all heard in one form or another. It gets thrown a lot around in American political discourse. But this slide actually shows us what polarization is. So this is a graph going back to 1949, which shows us Congress, okay? Each dot is a member of Congress. Blue are Democrats, red are Republicans. And what this graph does is it maps out the ideology, sort of left-right, right, of each member of Congress. Now in 1949, you can see they're fairly close together, close together, close together, close together, and something starts to happen towards the late 80s. The Democrats start to move this way and the Republicans move this way. And by this is the 1995, you see that not only are the two parties far apart, but increasingly they're close together. What that means is the parties don't agree with each other, and they agree with each other within themselves a lot. That is polarization, okay? Term you hear all the time, okay? Now, why is it that people think polarization is bad? All kinds of reasons. Creates policy gridlock. Should sound familiar to you. It degrades national discourse. It fosters inequality. It fosters segregation. It undermines trust and empathy. It weakens the bonds of citizenship, right? Now, just as a side note, okay, if you look at this graph and you think any of those concerns are valid, this is worrisome. It's also worth noting that, in a sense, what we've done in these last 20 years or so, or 25 years, is go much more towards the historical norm for America. America has often been very polarized. This post-war period, right, 49 through really into the 80s, is an anomaly, okay? But even if it's an anomaly, it still doesn't make us worry any less about our moment. Now, that may be true, and I've suggested a few reasons why people worry about this. But that's the elite level. That is Congress. What about people like us? I'm not a member of Congress. I don't view myself as particularly elite, okay? But what about people like us, okay? Well, Lillian Mason, she's a political scientist at the University of Maryland. She conducted a survey, and what she found is this: the more strongly you identify as a liberal or conservative, the more likely you are to not like the other side, okay? That's intuitive. But then she went further, okay? Meaning, again, if you're a strong liberal, you're probably not going to want to hang out with a strong conservative and vice versa. She goes further. She tried to figure out whether this was due to political identities or policy views, meaning if I'm a strong liberal and I have certain views about the economy, maybe that's why I don't want to hang out with a conservative. That's the policy side. What she found is that's not actually true, and here's how she did it. So, she found someone who identified as a moderate liberal, let's say, and is pro-choice, okay? That person is less hostile to marrying a conservative than someone who identifies as a strong liberal but is pro-life, right? So if we assume pro-choice is a liberal policy position, okay, the self-described moderate is more open to conservatives, even though they have the liberal position, than the self-described liberal. Same would hold on the other side. Meaning, if you think that you're a conservative first, or a liberal first, and not so much about the policies, you don't want anything to do with the other side of the aisle. So the stronger you identify as a partisan, the less you like the other side. This is ordinary people. This is not the elite level. Now, what this means is that this is a function of identity, not policy differences. Okay? Now, why might this be a problem? If this is a problem, it's going to be very hard to choose policies effectively. Again, if I'm a strong liberal and I'm confronted with a conservative who has a liberal policy view, I may reject that policy even though I like it because that person's a conservative. And you probably know people like this. Probably all of us are somewhat like this. I am at times. I try not to be. Okay? But it could also lead us to choose policies not because of their merits, but because of who we are. What else do we see on the micro level? And here I'm going to talk a little bit about social media. So this substantial paragraph here is from a New York Times article. This is August 21st. I came upon this as I was actually preparing this presentation. And it's pretty chilling. Now, what's going on here? Well, Facebook does a lot of weird things to us. And we aren't aware of what it does to us as it's doing it to us. Now, it undermines ways in which communities inculcate norms. Okay? Norms guide behavior, standards of what's appropriate or inappropriate, and those have historically been a function of fairly small sort of face-to-face interactions. Okay? How do you learn how to act in the library? Because you get shushed, okay? And you get shushed again and again. Everybody gives you a look, right? Well, That's one thing that Facebook does, is it undermines that. But it tends to undermine them in a bad way. It tends not to make you more moderate, it makes you more of an extremist. Because what it does is it tends to create like-minded groups, and then the algorithms supply you with content that feed that, okay? So now what this is talking about is a study that was done by researchers at the University of Warwick in England. And what they did was they studied every single anti-refugee attack in Germany over a 2-year period, 3,335 anti-refugee attacks. And what they found was this: in towns and cities with higher than average Facebook usage, there were more attacks on refugees. All things being equal, this is the most important predictor of whether there's going to be attacks or not, or how many there will be. More important than if it's a big city or a village, rich or poor, liberal or far right. 10%, they argued, of anti-refugee violence was directly a function of Facebook. And they point to the way in which social media scrambles your judgments about what is acceptable and what is normal, okay? We haven't noticed this is happening to us, but they argue it has. Now, I'm not just picking on Facebook here. It's easy to pick on Facebook. This is Twitter. Okay, a recent study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. What they tried to do was this: figure out how much do left, right, red, I'm sorry, right, left is blue, right is red. How much overlap is there in moral usage and moral language on Twitter? And the answer is not much. Not much at all. Okay? So what they did was they tried to figure out how moral and emotional is a tweet in terms of content. And if it is in that category, is it likely to be retweeted? And if it is it retweeted by people who are different? And the answer is no. You don't see a lot of action in the middle. Clusters here, clusters there, just like Congress. Okay, seems to be living in two worlds. As far as Twitter goes, we also seem to be living in two worlds. Now, why is this a problem from what I started with, the role of rhetoric in a free society? The problem is basically this, I would suggest. Classical rhetoric relies upon being able to assume an audience with a shared set of values, references, and ways of judging people who speak. Okay? Well, we cannot assume that today, arguably. Certainly not at the mass level, if all this data is in fact true. Is there a common ground, as classical rhetoric thought? Is there common sense that tells us there's a predictable way that people judge us for how we speak and how we don't speak? Now, insofar as politicians are rational, we can expect them to speak to people, not to reach out to those who see the world differently from them, given all these developments, but to preach to the choir. That's what we can expect. And if somebody were to come along in the face of all of this and say, I want to speak to the other side, I want to persuade people who think differently, they could be rejected not only by their opponents, but by their own side for being insufficiently pure, right or left. Or to return to the Federalist Papers, we could despair of the optimistic prospect that frames the Federalist Papers, that, as Alexander Hamilton said, societies of men are really capable, or the question rather, are societies of men really capable of establishing good judgment from reflection and choice, or are they forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force? That is the American experiment. That's what Madison and Hamilton and Jay are talking about in the Federalist Papers. So what can we do? That's all I understand very, very depressing. Well, I've got 3 things up here, and they're all what we can do, we, I think, ordinary citizens, right? One thing to note is this: ideological monotony, meaning a Facebook group or a social media group where everybody thinks alike, It produces harms, all sorts of harms, arguably. But ideological heterogeneity produces certain goods. First and foremost, it makes you more moderate in your own beliefs, which may have good spillover effects on things like policy, on governance, etc. And even if it doesn't make you moderate, it does make you more aware of what other people think and why. Okay? So it can lead to some kind of an understanding, less of the demonization. This is drawing on a wonderful book by Diana Mutz, who actually used to teach at UW-Madison, called Hearing the Other Side. Second, social media. So this is from a 2004 letter that Miss Manners wrote in response to someone who wrote to her and said, oh, why don't we talk politics at dinner parties anymore? Where did serious conversation go? Right? And here's how she responded about a dinner party. You mean people of mixed political opinions who are going to feel free to say what they think about the morals and intelligence of people who disagree with them about politics or sex or religion, she says, which are also banned from the dinner table? Now, there's a reason why Miss Manners says in 2004, and probably would still say today if one were to ask, that we shouldn't talk about religion, sex, or politics in mixed company. It is highly unlikely that people at the table will express their views and encounter those that differ in a polite way, especially at a dinner party if you're drinking wine, right? That's pretty intuitive. So, if we're going to have a pleasant evening and maybe have civility with the people at the table or form friendships with them, we avoid certain topics. This is how we've always done it in a way, right? In societies, period, in civilizations, okay? Now that is not true on Facebook. I don't need data to show this. Think about Facebook. Think how weird it would be prior to Facebook to just announce your political views to 5, 6, 7, or 600 or 700 or 1,000 people. That would be a very strange thing to do. We wouldn't normally do that. And if we did do it, it would be in a very particular social space. Somebody giving a campaign speech, or somebody standing in the middle of a college campus, or in England up on a soapbox by a train station. Very special places. But this was not something that was normally done. Now that is a very strange development when you think about it. Very strange. And I did think about this recently. I mean, I've stopped posting politically on Facebook by and large. I've gone back to what I think Facebook is best for: silly memes, cat videos, and pictures of my kid, because everybody likes pictures of, and honestly, if you don't, I don't want you in my network, right? So that's what I do, precisely because I realized how odd it was for me to be doing this. And I have political views, and they're quite strong. I just choose not to express them anymore as much as I can control myself. Now combine this with the fact, which I think is depressing, that we can watch the news and encounter opinion about the news all the time. This really starts in the 80s, right? Cable news, and it's accelerated. Now it's on the internet. It's all over the place. Now, what I'm getting at is this. We've lost, I would suggest, the social dimension of social media. Okay? Why are we actually there? It's to have friendships and relationships. And we have to think about the costs and benefits. Finally, my own view is this. I think it would be great if we started to teach people rhetoric, young people in particular, to teach them rhetoric. Why? First and foremost, it will make you a more savvy consumer. You will realize more effectively when you're being manipulated, okay? But more importantly, I'm hopeful it will actually teach us something more like what we could call empathy, or what Adam Smith called sympathy. When you can learn to argue persuasively for a case you do not agree in, you may come to see that people you disagree with aren't necessarily horrible human beings, okay? Living as we do in Wisconsin, what this would mean is that someone who is a Democrat, a strong Democrat, may not think that a Scott Walker supporter is evil, just as it did when I was living in Georgia, that a Republican might not think that a supporter of Obama is evil. Now, they may be evil, but not, I think, because of who they support politically, okay? If they do terrible things, that's a different situation. But I also think that if we can learn to disagree with each other without hating each other, which is not an easy thing to do, maybe we could speak to each other with an eye towards persuasion and not just victory at all costs.